biggest increase in decades. Now, NATO is actively discussing the possibility of removing more nuclear missiles from storage and placing them on standby mode. This move comes in response to increasing threats from Russia and China, and the adjustments aims to enhance NATO deterrence and defense capabilities amidst evolving global security challenges. So this and more will be the topic of our next conversation.
Indeed it is, and joining us to discuss NATO's response to the global challenges of today is Keir Giles, Senior Consulting Fellow on Russia and Eurasia Programme. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Good morning.
So would you say that the recent announcement is the right response? I mean, we've seen Russia basically doing its nuclear saber-rattling routine for quite a while now. We also know that China is expanding its nuclear forces. So is this the proper manner in which to remind these countries that, look, NATO is a nuclear alliance as well?
Well, it's worth looking closely at exactly what Jens Stoltenberg has said and what he's not. You mentioned that this reporting is coming from a British newspaper, The Telegraph. The reporting itself has come under a lot of scrutiny here and elsewhere because it seems that a lot more has been read into what Stoltenberg actually said. And his direct quotes don't actually support the reporting that we've seen in The Telegraph. He seems instead to be referring to the ongoing routine process under which NATO's nuclear planning groups consider what their posture should be, as opposed to any radical new departure. It's been spun up into a posturing in response to Russia, but in fact it could be something that is entirely routine. We should remember that this newspaper, The Telegraph, is the same one that is absolutely single-handedly responsible for the idea that Russia's Zapad exercise in 2009 ended up with a simulated nuclear strike on Warsaw. That's not supported by any other reporting anywhere else, and it all came from a Daily Telegraph headline writer reading more into the text than was actually there. So it's worth stepping back and taking a sober look at what actually has and has not happened, and it seems overall that it has not.
Certainly, as we know that NATO is, more on defense than anything else, and NATO's move to increase the nuclear readiness must be balanced with also efforts into nuclear diplomacy and also arms control. But looking at this broadly, how might now NATO's readiness affect also its relations with Russia? How do you think that Russia might respond to it?
Well, first of all, again, nobody is actually saying that NATO's nuclear readiness has been increased. There has not been a statement that more will be brought out of reserve and made ready for use. That is something that is being spun up by media reporting, but isn't supported by what Jens Stoltenberg has actually said. On the other hand, of course, it is a useful countermeasure to Russia's nuclear rhetoric, because one of the points that gets overlooked when responding to Russian nuclear intimidation is that Russia isn't the only nuclear power in the world. And the French response that we've seen to this in the past is a simple reminder when replying to some of these wild threats that come from Russia, that France has nuclear weapons too. Now, if it were the case that Jens Stoltenberg had done something of that kind, then yes, it would be an entirely appropriate reminder of the fact that it is not just Russia that has this kind of capability. But as I say, that doesn't appear to be what has happened in real life.
Would you say that greater strategic ambiguity is the way forward? We've seen certain criticism concerning the West's ability, if we can call it like that, to deter itself. Now, this self-deterrence has often manifested itself in the West clearly saying, look, we're not going to use certain types of weapons. We're not going to do certain things. Now, Russia has never done that. In fact, it has often been saying things that later did not come to pass, which is another thing altogether. However, would you say that time for self-deterrence is ended and should be replaced with a strategy which is predicated upon the idea that the enemy should always be on the lookout of something that we might be doing, even though we've actually not said anything about it?
Well, that should have happened a long time ago. It's long been the case that it's clear that ruling out courses of action that are the ones that would actually get Russia particularly worried is just an encouragement to the Kremlin. And this strategic ambiguity that you referred to is sometimes being used just as a fancy way of not telling your adversary what you're not going to do. As soon as you say, for example, that there is going to be no military response to Russian posturing when it's preparing to invade Ukraine, you remove the worst case scenario from Russia's risk calculations, and so you provide comfort and confidence to the Kremlin that they can go ahead without opposition. And it is long past time that practice stopped in the West.
Right, and I know what I would love us to move now to the visit by Jens Stoltenberg in the US, and seeing that now US has been shaping let's say, the strategy, the nuclear strategy within NATO. But what role really does it play in shaping the strategy as a whole, to your mind?
Well, there are very different nuclear postures and nuclear capabilities between NATO's three nuclear allies. And the key difference with the United States is what's referred to as extended deterrence. In other words, it is a nuclear deterrent not just to protect itself, but to protect its allies as well. And that's a distinctly different attitude than, for example, what France takes, where it's tied very specifically to French nuclear interests. The challenge with that, of course, is that if under a new presidency in the United States from next year, the principle of extended deterrence, that assurance for NATO allies that the US will protect them, is in any way eroded or challenged, then that, of course, gives Russia greater incentives and greater encouragement to engage in this nuclear brinkmanship, particularly because the British and French nuclear arsenals are very small compared to what Russia is.
And what did you say from an academic perspective? Because we know that in terms of trying to get this topic into a conversation with leaders of individual countries, now that is not a diplomatic thing to do. But, you know, as an expert, you're actually free to comment on that. Nuclear sharing, should that be extended to include countries of the eastern flank?
There's no rationale for not sharing nuclear weapons or the capability for delivering nuclear weapons with all of those countries that feel it will enhance their security rather than degrade it. And this, of course, has been an active conversation, not just in the longer-term easternmost members of NATO, but also among the new joiners, of course, Finland and Sweden. It contradicts their long-standing position that is anti-nuclear, but the new realities of the security situation mean that it is once again a live conversation and something that is at the forefront of people's minds when they consider defense cooperation agreements with the United States. So yes, this is a live issue, and it is something that it really does deserve considering.
And now, of course, we are still talking about the potential, but what are the potential risks and benefits of enhancing NATO nuclear readiness?
Well, it's worth comparing what's happening on the other side of the fence within Russia. And we've talked already a little about the ways in which Russia mounts these programs of nuclear intimidation and the ways in which it tries to shape decision-making in the West by using nuclear weapons, not by firing them, but using them as an information tool. And Russia has moved some of its nuclear-capable assets around to try to convince people that there is a greater danger. For example, putting missile launchers and nuclear weapons for carrying on aircraft forward in Belarus, and also moving them closer to its own borders. In effect, this makes no practical difference whatsoever, because if you have a weapon whose range is measured in hundreds of kilometers, moving at 50 kilometers one way or the other makes no difference at all, but it is all part of the political posturing. Now, on the other side, in the West, of course, you should be considering more exactly what operational benefit it would bring to move any of these weapons here or there, while still keeping half an eye on whether you are escalating the situation or simply responding to what Russia has already done in kind.
So would you say the situation today is actually deteriorating when it comes to the risk of any sort of confrontation or even inadvertent use of weapons of mass destruction? We know that for decades, the idea of mutually assured destruction has ensured a degree of restraint among global powers. What would you say would be the biggest threat today? For example, would you say that smaller countries trying to develop their own nuclear arsenals and that this could break this equilibrium? What is your take on that?
Well, Russia has been trying to convince us for years that this situation is deteriorating, that there is a very high risk of inadvertent nuclear escalation resulting from what they've referred to as miscalculation and some kind of clash which escalates out of control. And they've been so successful at putting this message across that sometimes it forms the basic logic that underpins a lot of the conversations about nuclear deterrence in the West. But in fact, Russia is bringing about precisely the situation that you were referring to with the West's help, because if they engage in nuclear blackmail, if they show that they can get their way and shape the behavior of their adversaries through these nuclear threats, it provides an incentive for other countries to go nuclear as well. It provides a a demonstration to countries that don't see any other way of defending themselves against nuclear powers, that if this kind of behavior is rewarded, and if you do actually achieve your foreign policy goals through the threat of nuclear weapons, it makes sense for everybody else to have them as well in order to ensure themselves against that kind of nuclear blackmail.
Thank you so much, sir, for joining us and also providing your insights on the matter.
Thank you.